Terror is a highway, because whether you go near or far, you're going to find something either you can't explain or that absolutely horrifies you. Today's episode is all about the highway and the terrifying things seen on it or next to it. I hope you're ready, otherwise you may just be tempted to burn your driver's license. Remember, send me your scary stories at darkstories.org so I can narrate them. This show is also available on your favorite podcasting app. Just look for Unexplained Encounters. And while you're at it, check out our other podcast, Freaky Folklore. We just released a new episode on the history and mythology of the Banshee. The comment of the day comes from my previous episode titled Real Sightings of Folklore Monsters. A viewer by the username of SCP-682 says, "Unlike some other comments, I had a great day, and these videos only make it better. Just so relaxing, you know." My reply? I've noticed whenever I release a video on Sunday night or Monday morning, people seem especially depressed and sad. I'm glad my show can help, but it just sounds like Garfield was right about Mondays after all. Here's to better days, my friends. Now, let's begin. I-95 Shadow, from Lucas W. I'm a truck driver, and at the time of this series of events, I was driving from Savannah to Jacksonville every night. To get to Jacksonville, I would take I-95. I was getting into my truck around 1 in the morning every day, starting my trip to Florida. There is a section of the road that gets really dark between exits 57 and 49. I never thought too much about it. Instead, I just listened to music and tried to get my night done as soon as possible. So I drove this route for about 6 months before my first encounter with this thing. One night, as I was driving south on 95, alone on the road, I look over and I see this form on the side of the road in the shape of a man. At first, this didn't bother me until I got closer and my headlights lit up the area around him. I noticed then that this thing didn't produce a shadow, and though my lights were all around him, I couldn't see a face either. I passed this thing, and it watched my truck the whole time. As I got on down the road, I saw it again and again, as if he was following my truck with his non-existent eyes, but soon it stopped, and for the remainder of the night, I didn't see him again. A few nights later, I saw him in the same area as before, but he didn't let me just pass him this time, because as I did, he began to run, and he kept up with my truck, which I keep at 70 miles per hour on I-95. For context, my truck was governed at that speed, so I couldn't go faster. As I kept looking over at him, he was shaking his head, as if to tell me no, or implying that I was not getting away from him. This was terrifying, since this thing seemed so confident that he could get at me, even with me in a rig moving at such a speed. This time around, there was a car ahead of me that I was catching up to. I was feeling like I was losing my mind, and when I got up to them, I slowed down to see if they could see him too. As I got further ahead of them bit by bit, the dark form got into their lane. I slowed down then, and that's when I saw the other car slam on their brakes, swerving into my lane to avoid this figure. So then I was sure that I wasn't the only one seeing it. Once the car was in front of me, they gunned it, leaving me there with this thing. I was scared like never before, and I've seen a lot. This thing was still moving towards me, looking at me. It was like he was laughing at me for not being able to get away. He was in the lane next to me, almost in my lane, when suddenly a motorcycle sped past us and he jumped in front of my truck. I then felt a thud at the front of my truck as I impacted this figure. I then felt my tires jounce, but I didn't stop and I didn't slow down. When I got to my first delivery store, I pulled in and the guard made a joke about me hitting a deer because my bumper had a huge dent in it. I pulled around to the back and got out to look at it before making my delivery, and sure enough, right where I would have hit that thing, there was a dent in my bumper, with blackish fluid surrounding it. I made my deliveries, and I did not leave Jacksonville until the sun came up. I've still seen him when I drive that section of 95 south at night. He walks with a limp now, but he doesn't chase after me anymore. Instead, he just waves. And though I've never seen a face, I know he's smiling at me. The Hiker, from Gavin. It's been 5 years since I got out. It's hard to realize the impact that one's decision to quit their career that they once had dreams of following would have on you. I was born to a father who fought in a war he was conscripted to, and my life story's not too different from most men my age in South Africa. As a tourist, it should be easy to understand why someone would volunteer to become a soldier, at the very least, to be closer to the wilderness of our nation. Leaving that way of life had its mental impact on my mind. Of that I am certain. This story happened after I left the force. It had been 2 years by then, when I had the chance to be a traveling salesman, selling car perfume and various other trinkets to petrol stations located all over the province of the Western Cape. It's actually quite a vast area to cover. Daily, I must have driven about 500 kilometers at the very minimum to try and make a living with charm and friendliness. However, the road is a lonely place. Many other drivers would attest to this. One day, it was about 7 p.m., and I was exhausted. I'd covered about 800 kilometers that day, driving from my home in Grabau to the furthest point I could and working my way back home slowly. It had been a successful day sales-wise, but I was at that point where my arms were locked and my eyes rested every 10 minutes for God knows how long, and I would jerk myself awake every so often. I had chosen to take a break and to drink an energy drink. I walked around a bit beside the road, drinking some water as well. I then chose to blast the radio as I took to the road again. Only 250 kilometers to go, and I felt so much better. There was much more traffic all of a sudden too, which kept me on my toes, and I was doing quite well. At the time, I drove a Nissan van, something called an NV200. Not much in the way of comfort or luxury, but it did have an air conditioner, which I blasted on my face. This helped immensely. I was closing in on a town called Caledon, driving on Highway N2, which was quite a nice road, with a yellow line and 2 lanes at places. Unfortunately, there was construction going on as I approached Caledon. This was done with concrete barriers in places, and the dreaded stop-and-go areas, spaced every 15 kilometers apart or so. Coming towards a hill where the 2 lanes now became one so the traffic coming from the other side was right beside you, I was approaching a hill. A few years before this, I'd attended quite a few trance music festivals in Caledon, so my memories of the place were pretty good. This particular hill had a view of a farm in the valley, below where a party I'd attended had been. The traffic was much thicker here as I started climbing the hill. Incoming cars were slowed to nearly 40 kilometers an hour, so I too slowed as I approached the top of the hill. That was fortunate, as the barriers were now right beside the lane, and on the top of the blind climb there was actually a truck going over, which slowed me down into a queue of about 5 cars. I remember looking out over the valley below, soaking in the beauty of the fields, stretching out into a kaleidoscope of yellow and greens, with sheep in their hundreds herding about. Looking beyond them, in the distance, were some acacia trees, which was usually where the festival was held. Smiling at the thought of good memories, the great music, and fun people, I felt nostalgic as my playlist shifted to a song I'm especially fond of. As traffic was basically crawling over the crest of the hill now, the sun chose to join in on making the view spectacular. God rays were shining out from the bottom of a cloud. My eyes traced the outline of the rays down onto something quite out of place and yet somehow fitting at the same time. From behind a concrete barrier, a girl in a flowing hippie dress had appeared. She smiled as her auburn hair was caught in the wind. As a warm-blooded man, I couldn't resist to look at this now incredible addition to the portrait God had created here. It really was perfect, and if I had the chance to, or the talent to, I would have painted this on a massive portrait. As I took in the sight, watching the girl, maybe it was a malfunction of the air conditioning, or my nose catching the smell of the boxes of car aroma I had in the back of the van, but I swear I suddenly smelled lilac or some sweet flower as I transfixed my eyes for longer on the beautiful girl. Then her eyes locked onto mine, and I might be mistaken, but I think I saw her lips move, mouthing some sort of message. By now the queue of cars were nearly stopped. Her eyes had not yet left mine. Hers were a green-brown with tales of the universe and existence caught in the glow of them. Suddenly, as the slope fell down and the cars started speeding up ahead of me, I noticed her hand rise into the universal sign for "Can I catch a lift?" A long tapered thumb into the rays of the sun. Heck, I'd already passed by now when checking in my rearview mirrors, which actually are quite crap on the van. I only saw the dull gray of the barriers behind me. Nobody had stopped, so I thought this through. I carried on until I could stop and turn around. Something in me said I should forget about danger or caution, but to be a Samaritan and probably freak the girl out, as I'd likely crash from staring at her. But I wanted to help her out. These things went through my mind as I turned into a farm's road and made the U-turn to get back up the hill. I was thinking about how she was traveling light. She didn't seem to have any bags, so she probably just wanted a lift into town. Confident that I could help her out and hurry home after that, I made my way back. I wasn't 3 kilometers away now, and I sped up the hill to offer a lift. As could be expected, she was no longer there. Only concrete, but traffic was flowing better now. Laughing at myself and knowing what my significant other would say at my folly, I carried on down the other side again, and made the turn to return to the one I actually missed. Coming up the hill again, the sight was even more gorgeous this time. The sun was setting, a few dark clouds had come to announce the arrival of the evening, and in the last bits of light, the whole scene was different, yet so spectacular now. Looking toward the clump of trees in the distance, again the sun shone its rays, now over the massive clouds, giving the earth its last bit of magnificence till the next day. My eyes followed the rays down again, onto the landscape, and there she was, not moving now, just smiling at me. This time, I could stop. The road was empty. To say her voice was angelic was an understatement. She actually laughed at me and clambered into the only other seat available, next to me in the front of the cabin. I asked her if she only needed to go to town, and her reply was but a smile. I may not have encountered many women before, but I've never been so overwhelmed as to not answer questions of logic, or to ask the questions to get answers, yet she didn't answer mine. I focused on driving and remembered that I had somewhere to get to, so I figured this good deed of mine better be over pretty soon. Looking over at the girl, it felt as if I had entered some cinematic sequence. She was looking out the window, the air conditioner blowing her hair, making her seem like one of those women you carve out in the front of your old sailing ship, the hair always fluttering back perfectly. Her face had the expression of happiness, probably with the knowledge of making the journey much easier now. The landscape had only become darker though, but somehow she was looking at something out there that had her full attention. Trying to be a good driver, I first checked the road ahead, but it was quiet and calm. So I tried spotting just what this girl was staring at. Far away in the darkness of the night, there was a herd of sheep entering a pen. You couldn't quite make it out, but the white of their wool had made it just possible to watch them go in, one by one. Gavin. Nobody had spoken my name this way before. Gavin. Ahead in the road, a truck had turned sideways. I watched it fall over onto its side. It felt like it was going in slow motion. Grabbing the steering wheel, pushing down hard on the brakes, and bringing the old white van to a stop, I was out of the vehicle and near the cabin of the driver in an instant. It had only been my vehicle and the truck on the road for a while, so I knew I had to help the driver in case he'd gotten hurt. I opened his door, and I was astounded to find that the driver was my mother's cousin. He was all right, luckily. But then I realized I may have made a mistake. Not even thinking of the girl, I turned around to my van to see if I'd become a victim to our country's well-known theft statistic. Instead, I saw my door was open, and the girl was gone. As I waited for a tow truck to assist the driver and to get him going again, me and my mother's cousin spoke. He asked me if I'd known that I was behind him about an hour ago, that if I ended up passing him, he would have greeted me with a honk of his horn. I came out with the truth, that I had turned around to pick up a hitchhiker. He then asked what they looked like. I timidly described her as an auburn-haired girl in a dress, a flowing yellowish dress. Maybe it was the shock settling in after the accident, but he shouted, "No way! I just flipped this truck because of her." He told me how he had seen her appear from under the shade of a cluster of trees in the darkness as his truck lit her up. He was about 300 meters away when she had run across the road right towards him. He agreed that she looked like a hippie, so she was probably under the influence of something. Finally, about half an hour later, help arrived. I was on my way again, though I was really freaked out. The final stretch of road was up a mountain pass. As I was about halfway through, my whole body shivered. Maybe it was just the extreme exhaustion, I tried to tell myself. Gavin. It came from behind me, and the van was packed with stock, with no room in the back at all for anyone to try to squeeze into. I checked my mirrors. I started to stop the vehicle as I did this. There's no way she could have gotten in the back of the van. All I saw in the mirrors was the final ray of light from the sun somehow shimmering out there at 9 p.m. I was a bit shocked, but as I stopped the van, I ran around and opened the side doors to it. But I found nothing. I even walked around the van and checked under it, but there was nothing there. And so I set out again, and when I made it home, I was more relieved than I'd ever been. Apartment off the highway, from Texas Tuxedo. I'm a 40-year-old female. This happened about 20 years ago, before everyone owning a cell phone was the norm. I lived in a one-bedroom, second-story apartment with my boyfriend. That apartment was right off the interstate. Some people might complain about traffic sounds, but I found it soothing, and I would often fall asleep with the window open, letting the steady hum of traffic lull me to sleep. My boyfriend and I both worked at the same car dealership, so we basically kept the same hours. However, he was in a band and would often go to band practice straight from work, so he would be gone late into the night on those nights. I'll admit, I didn't like to be alone in that apartment. There was an attic inside the closet in the bedroom. I hated this, as I thought that another resident would be able to go into their attic and come down into our apartment. At one point, my boyfriend went into the attic to reassure me that this was not possible to do. And even then, I wasn't satisfied. I would wedge a tabletop between the dresser and closet door to make me feel assured that it could not be opened from the inside where the attic access was. One night while my boyfriend was gone to band practice, I was sitting on the sofa watching a movie. The bedroom door behind me began to slowly creak open. I leapt from the sofa and bolted out the front door without even looking behind me. I ran down the stairs to my car in the parking lot, where I locked myself in and waited until my boyfriend returned home later that night. On another occasion, my boyfriend and I had been gone late into the night to his band practice. By the way, he was the singer in a rock band, so don't go picturing a trombone player or something like that. Quite literally, it was a dark and stormy night. Thunder was booming, and the lightning strikes were intense. We changed into our comfy jammies and settled down in front of our ancient 1970s floor model television to watch a Richard Pryor stand-up comedy on satellite. The television sat directly in front of a heavily draped sliding glass door. I sat on the floor, inches from the curtains at my boyfriend's feet, who sat in a chair. With a loud bang of thunder and a flash of lightning, we lost satellite signal. I was curious to see how bad the approaching storm was, since it had knocked out our satellite, so I stood and jerked back the curtains to look outside. I was not prepared for what I saw. There on my balcony was a man. He was crouched and close to the glass door. He grinned up at me. He never moved. He didn't even flinch as I began to scream hysterically. I couldn't move a muscle. I could only scream. My boyfriend would later tell me that I actually said something. I'd said, "It's so horrible," although I have no memory of that. At the time, he said the way I was screaming, he fully expected to see a dead animal hanging from the balcony. Instead, he leapt from his chair and jerked back the drapes on the sliding glass door. Only then, when the peeping perv saw my boyfriend, did he stop grinning at me. The peeping Tom leapt with Olympic-like agility to the balcony railing, then leapt down to the ground. I called 911 as my boyfriend bolted downstairs to hopefully find and pummel this creep. The police were amazing and arrived in seconds. They quickly had the peeping perv cuffed. This caused quite the scene, and many apartment residents came out, including the apartment manager. We did learn the pervert's name that night, and also learned that he was a serial peeper who would randomly stalk and peep on women, and he would try to convince his friends to do it with him. I actually did get PTSD from this for a short time. I wasn't really harmed, but I could not have the lights out around me at all for some time after this. This meant sleeping with not just a nightlight, but literally every light in the apartment on. Well, that was when I could actually sleep. The stress proved too much, and we did move shortly after, adopting a Rottweiler to help guard me and make me feel safe. There was never a follow-up from the police or a court date or anything like that. I was young at the time and never thought to press for follow-up information. I don't know what happened to the peeping pervert, but just remember this. On a cold, dark, and stormy night, before you make that decision to open the blinds or jerk back your curtains, there may be someone just on the other side of that thin glass, looking back at you. The Haunted Highway. From you/TheQuietDriver. I'm a private hire taxi driver, basically a taxi driver without the taxi license. I live on the island of Trinidad, where I basically ply my vehicle for hire near the capital, and that usually is how it is. It's not easy work, and it can be dangerous at times, but I like it, and it's better than working in a factory or a desk job in a stuffy office. Other than working around my home village and the capital, I also sometimes get hired by people who want me to either drop them off on the port to catch the ferry or to the airport. Those jobs pay well, and I can make a decent chunk of cash on an airport run, so I'm very happy when I get to do one. This is how my story starts, when I had just finished such a run. The passenger had just returned from a trip to Miami, and I got hired to drop them home. The thing was that they lived in the southern part of the island, near the town of La Romaine, meaning after I dropped them home, I had a long drive ahead of me before I would make it home. It also didn't help that their flight came in about 8 o'clock that night. But I'd been paid through my cousin. He was the one who gave the couple my number, since his car wasn't working, so I couldn't complain. At the airport, I met the nice couple and told them that I was the driver my cousin told them would be picking them up. After we exchanged pleasantries, I loaded up my station wagon and we were off. As I drove, the couple and I chatted to pass the time. They were pretty cool. They told me about their trip and asked me if I liked what I did for a living and how I was related to my cousin. Eventually, we arrived at their home just after midnight. After helping them with their bags, the couple gave me a tip of $100 and suggested that I spend the night instead of making the long drive back up north. Honestly, I didn't feel right about that and told them that it would be alright. I left a few minutes to 1. Now that I think about it, if I had known what I know now, I would have stayed the night. After making a quick stop at the gas station to fill up and grab a Coca-Cola, I made my way back onto the highway and got ready for the long drive ahead. Now, this highway was and still is a major artery on the island. It was only one of 2 roadways that connected north with south, and between the two it was the more direct route. But at that hour of the night, the only other traffic on the road that night were container trucks and more than a few street racers. It began to drizzle when I made it onto the highway, and within 5 minutes it began to pour down, and I mean really pour. Normally I would just slow down and push through, but in my fatigued state, and with the rain showing no signs of letting up, I decided that I should just pull over and get some sleep. Hey, I may not be licensed, but I still take my driving seriously. Fortunately, there was an off-ramp leading to a flyover, or overpass, and next to it was a clearing where some trailers were parked. Even if I couldn't go in, I could still park off the highway and the road leading into the site. So that's what I did. I came off the highway and thankfully was able to park near the trailers, before switching off the engine and adjusting my seat. I could now see flashes of lightning outside my car as the heavy rain pounded my vehicle. I wasn't comfortable by any means, but I was able to doze off eventually. I don't know how long I was sleeping, but I suddenly heard what sounded like someone tapping on the glass. It was loud enough to wake me up, but when I got up, the rain had stopped, but there was no one there. Shrugging it off and still being too sleepy to drive, I attempted again to go back to sleep, but as I closed my eyes, I heard the tapping again. This time, it was coming from the back glass. I shot up again and looked, but once again there was no one. Getting annoyed, I got out of my car, stupid I know, and I began to look around. But there was nothing, save for the sounds coming from the highway every time a truck passed. A little unnerved by now, I decided to get back in the car and lock the doors. But this time, I was going to wait to see just who at this hour was messing around. I noticed the rain had begun to fall again, and I could feel myself starting to fall asleep, when suddenly I began to feel someone, or rather something, shaking my car. I got up again and looked around, but there was no one around, yet the car was shaking as if someone was outside doing it. At this point, I had had enough, and I started my car, getting ready to bolt out of there. But as I fumbled with my keys, I looked up, and I wish I hadn't. In front of my car was what appeared to be a woman with long hair who was dressed in what I could describe as a turn-of-the-century type of dress. But her face, that was the unsettling part. Despite being near a street lamp, I could not make it out. There were not features I could make out at all, but I felt as if she was looking right at me. Finally, I was able to get the key in the ignition, and I sped out of there once the engine started. I didn't stop driving until I made it home. I've always heard the stories about that particular stretch of highway from some of the older taxi men, of how it's cursed, and that the curse is responsible for many of the fatal accidents that occur in that area. As the stories go, the highway is haunted by the spirit of a woman who has been seen walking along the shoulder at night, sometimes running in front of cars and causing them to crash when they try to avoid her. I think on that night, I encountered that spirit, and she obviously didn't want me to be there that night. All I know is that the next time I have to do such a run again, I'm not stopping at that flyover ever again.